Tansi Nitutemtek. Good morning, people of Montreal and of the world. Welcome to our conversation today. I'm here on the unceded lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal. So pleased to be having another conversation with Imelda McCarthy, who's coming to us from around or in Dublin, and is who I consider to be a master teacher and leader in the family therapy movement, which has branched out to a lot of different movements and positionalities today. So welcome, Imelda. Do you want to tell us a little bit about where you are today and what's going on for you?
Well, I'm so happy to see you as always, and thank you for that high-flown introduction. I'm always kind of a bit taken aback by it, but thank you. I appreciate it. Yes, I'm in Dublin, and I live in Dublin, which is on the east coast of Ireland, halfway down along the east coast, and we have a reasonably nice sunny day, and we're probably later into springtime than you are because we're in cherry blossom time at the moment, and it's the land is oozing with growth and color and vibrancy and new leaves, and we've had a lot of sunshine, which we don't often get here on this land of ours. But so it's very beautiful here at the moment.
Mm. Yes, well, I'm envious. I'm sure we don't really have much spring in Montreal. It goes basically from winter to summer with about a 2 week transition period. So summer will soon come. We had scheduled to talk on St. Bridget's Day, and I think we share an interest in the land and the spirituality of the land and traditions and, whatever people want to call it. I was going to say folklore, but some things that are folksy are just reality for other people. So would you like to pick up a conversation about the context of your work? Because when I studying family therapy, I could see there were lots of shoots and movements here and there, and some of them were from the west or the east coast of the United States. But the ones that were happening in other places in the world, like Milan or where you are, were born out of a certain cultural context. And I know that's where the fifth province came from. But more generally, I wanted to ask you how your culture and that land influenced your therapeutic practice and your work with families.
Well, when I started working as a family therapist, it would have been probably sometime around the mid 70s. And Ireland we'd been through the 60s, but we weren't in the center of it. And Ireland was still a poor country. Really, until we got into the 90s, it was quite a dark place, a monochrome place. But there was beginning to be the emergence of a celebration of our culture here. And there were little shoots taking place, both in the north of the country and in the Republic in the south, that were really energizing and weren't against, it wasn't this aggressive nationalism. It was a celebratory kind of embrace of who we are, the land we came from, the stories we came from, the music that was ours over generations. Because even though we were colonized and our language was taken from us, it still managed to live on in places. But the music was never quietened, was never silenced. And so during the 70s and 80s, there was the birth of a new emergence and celebration of that. We had traditional Irish musicians that became well known across the world, like the Clancy brothers, and probably the most famous of them, the Dubliners, the Chieftains. And then we also had, as we moved on through the 80s, Riverdance, which kind of exploded onto the international scene, and the music was written by an old college mate of mine. Um, and it celebrated Irish dance in a way we'd never seen Irish dance before. And the principal dancers were two Irish American dancers who had grown up with Irish dancing. And it was quite a thrilling time there. Now, at the beginning of the 80s, I started also working with Nullig Byrne and Phil Carney. And we began to be referred families where a young daughter had disclosed sexualized abuse in the family. Usually, in our case, it was by fathers or father figures. And there was a very scant literature in family therapy at that time. There were one or two papers from England, some from the States, and really none of them were very systemic, apart from one set of colleagues in England who were exploring systemic practices with families that had the same problem. Um, and we found the literature kind of quite Anglo-American.
Mhm.
And the people we were seeing were speaking in a more colloquial way that could be quite shocking to people who were looking for some kind of an Anglo-American response. Number one, their answers weren't clear. Generally, they had multiple levels of meaning. And at the time, there was a lot of talk about Irish American families, and it would have been an idea in England too about Irish people is that we were always telling stories, and that it was very hard to know what we meant because we really didn't speak in a very clear way. So we began to talk among ourselves about how was this reflective of our culture rather than a site of pathology. And as we listened, we found that very often the men in these families, the fathers, the abusers, were speaking in a way that wasn't that different from the way men spoke down in the pub about women, because it was quite a misogynistic time. Um, and so we saw it as a kind of more cultural way of speaking rather than, and even though it had misogynistic overtones big time. Um, and that also the mothers and the girls were not really in a position, none of them were in a position to speak clearly because there were high consequences of family sundering if they did. And that was very much we saw too as a legacy of our own colonial past. And it's a feature, I think, probably if you look at most colonized people, is that their poetry is full of ambivalence and ambiguity and a love of words and a play on meaning and all of that. And uh, so we saw this as a kind of more post-colonial legacy. And so we began to play with ways in which we could have conversations that really address that ambiguity. And in the responses we were being met with by playing with both sides of an argument that was being given, or asking people for different opinions. And it was very much influenced also by Bateson and Milan questioning. Because one of the things that we were very struck with was that Milan's way of asking questions was an invitation to us all in a second order system to help see the system. It was like the system seeing itself. So there were very many different viewpoints as explored and juxtaposed. So that Lynn Hoffman had a great saying that if you juxtapose realities, you kind of create a tautness and a vibration. and that something new can emerge out of that. We also had an artist or poet who said that when you do that, you pull taut the nerves of insight, which is kind of a nice poetic description of that.
Next level
So,
here. Yeah, 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 yeah.
so we began to explore these kind of processes with the families, and we found that rather than, because we often had the statutory professionals in with the families, and so we were very observant about where we were listening from and how we were speaking. Um, I've called that laterally the politics of listening and the ethics of speaking. So how do you open space for people to explore different facets of very difficult situations, but also are aware from the site that you're listening from,
Mhm.
and what kind of contextual informings and deformings are involved in that. Um, So one of the things that we didn't want to do was to colonize these families that were, in real danger of being colonized by the state. That's not to say that we ignored that something bad and violent and abusive had happened
Mhm.
to somebody and that somebody else had perpetrated these acts. But the questions, rather than like one of the big things at the time was that was very hard to get parents to acknowledge abuse. So one of the things that we kind of looked at was, well, if, the director of social services was to hear this conversation, what opinions do you think they might have?
Mhm.
So it was to create a meta context. It's not a word you hear very often these days in systemic practice, but to create a meta context for us all to look at, what might other observing assistants or observers have to say about this, or what might the judge in the court say?
Mhm.
What would he say to dad? What would he say to mom? What would he say to the child involved? And the other thing is looking very closely at what were the words in the metaverse that the families were giving us, and seeing how we could um, kind of move alongside those. Now, sometimes moving alongside of us, and it depended, this was totally dependent on what the family had given us. We might sometimes exaggerate that a little bit. And sometimes you saw in that exaggeration that these, um, you pushed the situation beyond a comfortable level for them and for all of us, not only them, for all of us. And sort of surprising things would happen, like parents might begin to acknowledge that something was going on. They mightn't acknowledge, or father in particular, mightn't acknowledge the whole extent of what was going on. But there was some movement towards it. And so what we saw was that disclosure was more a process than an event.
Mhm.
And so they were some of the ways that we use that kind of notion of ambiguity and ambivalence. And I remember when we went to the States first, it was one of our first presentations, and we had the title of the presentation, we had the word ambivalence alongside incest or child abuse. And the Americans were horrified
Mhm.
because that meant only one thing to them as far as we understood at the time. And that was that we were ambivalent towards what had happened. Whereas it wasn't meant to be that. It was the ambivalence and the ambiguity in the context and in the discourse and in the language that was used and in the kind of relationships, because you had different configurations of relations. Sometimes you had mom and dad together in denial, and you had a young person, young girl, in being protected by social services. So you had two opposing, if you like, coalitions. And so that produced ambiguity and ambivalence. But that's what it referred to. It was a structural reference and not an emotional reference. So that very much came from our culture and how we understood it, and came to use a lot of our writers and our poets and at that time, and I still do go back there. And the other thing is the land is very important. Like most Indigenous peoples across the world, the land is extremely important in Ireland, and the land is feminine. So we're a goddess culture. And of course, that was torn down with the arrival of Christianity in the 5th century. And the interesting thing is that, our national emblem is a shamrock, which has 3 leaves. And it's the myth or the folklore is that St. Patrick, who was a British Roman, um, went to teach the Trinity, the Christian Trinity of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit using the shamrock. But Ireland was absolutely used to trinities in those days but they were all trinities of goddesses. So you had the major goddesses of like Eru, Banba, and Fola. And Eru was the goddess that gave her name to Ireland, because the Irish for Ireland is Era. So you could see even in that teaching with the shamrock of the Trinity, where it was recast as a male Trinity from being a female Trinity. And little by little, of course, that was eroded probably up until the 12th century, when it was pretty much eradicated. So very aware of all that in my work, and drawing on that. And like the 80s, now there is another resurgence and reinterest in culture and Irish culture. And except this time it's much more inclusive, because we have quite a few immigrants in the country, and they're kind of involved in bringing this forward. And that's really interesting and lovely to see. That Irish doesn't mean you're white and Catholic, you know. It has opened up to be much more inclusive. That's not to say that we don't have the problems that every other country are having with around the issues of immigration and people coming to live in the country. But yeah, so this time round in 2025 feels like it felt in the 80s, except more open, and with different influences coming into it. But there's again, a resurgence of interest in Irish philosophy, and a guy called John Moriarty, who was a philosopher who unfortunately died young, and another one that you probably know, John O'Donoghue, who also died young, and a big resurgence in music and developing the music. And yeah, so this time has memories of the 80s going into the 90s. And in the 90s in Ireland, we kind of lost the run of ourselves. We had the Celtic Tiger, and we became kind of rich quick and became very consumerist and materialistic. And I think we lost some of our magic at that time. So it's nice to see it kind of re-emerging and being more inclusive this time.
Yeah. One of the differences that I see is that you have more women in positions of government power now than in the 70s. There's some pretty good role models for women in leadership. Do you mind if I go back to the language part? I was going to ask you, this use of ambiguity and multi-level meaning, would you characterize that as an act of resistance?
Yeah, because we were resisting the colonization of the Anglo-American push for clarity and saying what you mean.
Yeah, I love that. And I see parallels between that and the indigenous people here who are seen as storytellers. And, the methodology is to share teachings in a story and that everyone will get something that resonates with them. And that doesn't work in a courthouse very well, but
Oh,
that kind of like you call it, that Anglo dominant feeling, like these people
hmm.
are muddled and evasive and all over the place. Yeah.
Yeah. And in some ways, I think, part of maybe our work as systemic practitioners is help people to become more multilingual and also to become more multilingual ourselves, because that's just another language form.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it's an imposed language form because, well, in the States and in Ireland and in Canada, I presume, it's a kind of it's a British structure. It's a British process. And, I think it'll probably take a lot more time before it becomes something different. I don't know if it ever will.
Is it
If
the
the if the
problem?
world lasts,
Yeah, sorry.
if the world as we know it lasts.
Yes, well, it's these circles and relationships with the earth and resistance that will help us to make her last. I
And
hope.
community, I think going forward, and that was one of the great things, when I came into systemic practice, what were the use of teams and working in teams, because they became little communities and they became sites of resistance. You mentioned Milan, they met in a coffee house around the corner from their clinics, and they interrogated and explored and excavated Bateson and tried to make their practices as Batesonian as they could. And we had a kind of similar experience of closing ourselves off in a mirrored room, like a room with one-way mirror, where we used to see clients, but nobody knew what we were doing in that room.
Mhm.
So it was kind of building these little communities, and the communities we built actually in the early days were not in Ireland; they were internationally. Um, because in Ireland, I suppose like a lot of Northern Europe, there was the tall poppy syndrome.
Mhm.
Is you couldn't put your head above the parapet because it would be shot off pretty quickly. Who do they think they are, and who's given them the right to say that? And I remember them when they'd nothing, and who do they think they are? So, so you we kept quiet for a long time, and it wasn't until then our writings and people at home began to filter back from abroad, actually, that we were out and about. I was called a has-been by one of our students as a joke because she used to say Imelda has been everywhere.
Oh, that's
And
lovely.
we still laugh about that. Yeah, and she's a very senior person now, terrific person.
That seems. Can I go back to the this idea of the tautness? I just found that fascinating. And when you talked about pushing the situation to an uncomfortable level, was that part of questioning at the extremes?
Yes, that's exactly what it was. Yeah,
So, for
yeah.
example, if the abuse in the house doesn't stop, who will die first?
It might be something like that. That would be more, yeah, masked in physical abuse. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Or who do you think would be the most likely person in your family to kill the abuser or to commit murder? Or we had a very violent family that we saw at one stage, and large family, and they were creating havoc in their neighborhood and in the community at large. And they agreed. It was unbelievable. They agreed to come and see us. But the mother was very angry with the father, and she didn't really want him around. And the father had been very abusive to the kids. And so one of the questions prompted by something that one of the kids said was asked is, if your mother was to choose one of you to murder your father, who might that be?
Hmm.
But the permission really, and I use permission, really had to be given from the families to ask those kind of questions. Like we didn't come up with them, do you know, to say, oh, we'll ask that, you know. Um, but what we might do is what we call juxtapose something. So, for example, I was seeing somebody who had been one of the children that was sold out of Ireland into adoption in the States. In other words, she was taken from her mother and she was given to an American Catholic family to be reared. And she didn't have really a very good experience in her adoption experience. So she came back to find her mother, but also to live here. And she had two children, I think, at the time. But she was very afraid of going out at this stage. And so I took her fear and I said, what was the most fearless thing you ever did? So that would be to create a juxtaposition. And she said, having a one night stand with a guy who was out of control. And so then you can kind of question at those extremes. It's like when somebody is out on a ledge and they're threatening to jump and you go out on the ledge with them. So it was well, in being with this man, what's the worst thing that could have happened? And she said, well, I could have been raped and I could have had a child, and that child might be taken from me like I was taken from my mother. So that produced a very different story. She hadn't come in with that story. So, so those kind of unusual, unforeseen things happened when you juxtaposed and you kind of pushed out the limits a little bit, but always in line with the story that the person or people were giving you.
Hmm. Well,
Um,
I love that. I mean, these ideas are so creative, and like you say, they come from inside the situation, and all you have to do is be perceptive, right?
yeah, yeah, to be open, and I suppose I love that, Chickeen's idea of the curiosity, to keep your curiosity there. But it really means really listening.
Mhm.
And then being, I suppose, hyper aware of when you're hearing things, and particularly when they don't sit with you or they sit too easily with you. What are the kind of discourses that are informing your either not listening or you're over listening or you're.
Mhm.
And that would come particularly on the pull to join sides with somebody
I
in
see.
a very fragmented situation where joining sides might not be helpful. Now, there may be other situations where you had to join sides, do you know?
Mhm.
But in an exploratory conversation, it's not usually the best thing to do.
No, and I love that, bringing in the third party, the fly on the wall. Well, what would the law say? Like, I can understand why you would, steal a loaf of bread, but I wonder, like, what will the judge say if it goes?
Mm, mm, mm,
And so you can bring in other perspectives
mm.
like that.
And also, if they say, well, the judge might think I should go to prison or something like that. You can then bring in class and context and poverty and social exclusion and all of that. That generally were in the lives of the people, certainly we were seeing. And, I have continued to see either, if not directly, but also through supervision. So, yeah, it opens up other contexts. And it reminds me a little bit of Nora Bateson's idea of warm data, and that is to become immersed in a multi-contextual and trans-contextual context that has multiple views of particular issues, so that you can move around them, and they don't allow for you getting overfixed or fixated on a particular idea or situation or that, and but you stay in community.
Mhm.
And I really go back more and more now because you see so much separation in the way people think and in the way silos are being created. I don't know what it's like in Canada, but over this end of the world, there's the emergence of a lot of silos that are in competition and with each other, and a lot of the dialogue is nasty and excluding and seen as racist or anti-Semitic or anti-trans or homophobic or whatever. It's and I believe at this time in our world that we need to be committed to community and being together,
Mhm.
and that we celebrate difference, but we don't separate in difference.
Mhm. Yeah, that's pretty important. So would you say there is a, I don't know, a community or a residual community of people like yourself and your former colleagues and work friends from like across the globe?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, one of the nice things that I was part of recently was when the Dulwich Centre set up an archive for just therapy work. So all the just therapy work is there. So their work is now accessible again.
Wonderful.
And so that's fantastic. I mean, the work that you guys are doing, the work that Alan's doing, and I am just so proud that he's got the Medal of Honor. It's just extraordinarily wonderful. It's also wonderful for our field, and for our community. Um, so what you guys have been doing over those years has been so tremendously important. And also what Stephen Madigan is doing in his building narrative communities and looking for different ways of working with really difficult situation. The work that um, Vicky Reynolds is doing is extraordinary. So yeah, I feel a very strong bond, you know. Also, what Gail Simon is doing in England and in setting up open source. Um, her journal is an open source, and she's extending that, and she's publishing books that mightn't necessarily get published by other people at the time. So, yeah, I feel a strong affinity with people who are doing things like that.
Mhm.
And also I think that are trying to be rigorous in systemic thinking.
Mhm. Do you
Because I
find,
think a lot of the rigor is gone.
yeah, where you are, do you find that there's like a new generation that's carried your work forward in Ireland?
No, I wouldn't think so. I think people find it complicated.
Hmm.
And we didn't set up an institute because we wanted it to be a kind of a liminal space, an imaginal space. We didn't want to concretize it. But on the other hand, we three of us worked in different situations. Um, so it would have been hard enough to set up a kind of an independent site. Um, so that didn't help. And also, we didn't teach it, I think, when we were all teaching together, because we didn't want to exclude our other colleagues.
Okay.
Now, looking back, that may have been a little bit of a mistake. We maybe should have found other way to do it. Um, so while the work is taught for sure on the courses, I wouldn't say that too many people are kind of rigorously following us. There is one woman, and there are people who certainly use the metaphor and have used it very nicely over the years and in important situations. But no, we don't have anything like a school or a following or anything like that. And in a way, I'm kind of pleased enough about that.
Yeah, excuse me. Just before we wind up, I wanted to ask you about spirituality. And I know that you have your own practices. When you work with the families, and some of these very severe
Mm.
cases of, you know, violence or, you know, poverty and suffering. Did you find that the families brought in spirituality ever as something that they could lean on or turn to or think about? How did that concept of the, you know, the
Well, it didn't really come into our teamwork per se,
yeah.
but we always felt that the conversations were sacred
Mhm.
and that we were being invited into people's lives that were very difficult, and that was a very precious invitation.
Mhm.
So we had to hold it in this kind of sacred way. So we did feel that. When I met my spiritual teacher and I saw that how he was uh, understanding his spiritual journey and his spiritual lineage, which was a non-dual tradition. It just spoke to me so much as being parallel to our systemic understandings and practices. And but what I would have gotten from him that was over and above that was the importance of presence and kind of living your talk and involving yourself in communion with people so that it's not that you don't use technique or methodologies or anything like that, but that who you are with them is more important. And how they resonate with you is much more important. And I've talked about that as communion for a long time, or communing, and using terms like interaction as intra-action. So it's something that emerges out of that liminal between space that doesn't belong to either of us, and yet we are an intrinsic part of it. Um, so so I would think that's how the spirituality came into my work, not by me necessarily talking about it, although some people would be interested. Three of my clients, eventually, not by me kind of being over inviting them or anything like that, came into our meditation community and are now in our Sangha. Um, but something they would probably say, well, some of them had been kind of interested in spirituality and hadn't found a home and kind of resonated with what we were doing. And when they found out that I ran a meditation group, asked me if they could join. And I would say, well, we have to leave a little bit of time and I can't see you again. And we had to, put some boundaries around it. But that all happened. So I think there's 4 in the group now that would have been originally clients going back. Um, so I don't necessarily openly speak about it, but if somebody says something and I feel that they might like to sit in silence for a few minutes, I will invite them to do that if that's something they want to do. Um, but I don't overtly speak about it. But I might often say, in terms of resources, that when I ask people what are the resources that they call on in their daily lives, an awful lot of people say without any prompting, God. So then I would say, well, how do you understand God? And how do you use it? And so it would develop from there. But I wouldn't say that I go in and say, okay, I'm doing a spiritual kind of therapy.
Yeah.
But I would say that every conversation I have is spiritual.
Mhm.
But the other person mightn't see it like that.
Yeah, I've been working with Christopher Kinman, as you know, running supervision groups, and we've
I
been
love
talking
Chris.
a bit
Yeah.
about hell lately. And I'll give you the context later. But what came to mind was, juxtaposing heaven and hell, and if people sometimes, in that Catholic framework, if sometimes people feel like they're living in hell, and wondering what it would be like to live in a more heavenly realm. I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember, just as you were talking there, I was remembering a man I worked with at one stage, and he had left his family, so he came to see me on his own at the time, and he didn't want anybody else to be involved. And he had such a kind of negative experience about his life and that, and so he was constantly talking about dying and the relief from suffering and that. And I kind of then began to ask him as he looked back on his life from his deathbed, what would he see? And the interesting thing was he came up with a whole different other story
Hmm.
of good things and the importance of the birth of his children and how much his children meant to him and various other um like good things in his life. So it was completely different from the story he had been telling before. And that was kind of another kind of a question at the extreme, but a gentle one about because he was talking so much about death, about what would he see from his deathbed. Um, yeah. So it is about, I like those juxtaposings and I use them all the time. And they come from our diamond, which goes back to our cultural kind of resonances, is that we have a site outside Dublin which is over 5,000 years old. It's older than the pyramids, the Egyptian pyramids. And the rock drawings all have diamond shapes, like lozenge shapes, diamond shapes, and spirals. Now, spirals are pretty common across the world to various, I mean, they're large right across the Celtic world, but they're also, in other cultures. So I always have a spiral. I always wear my little spiral. It's a tiny little one. Um, and we made up our working kind of framework for holding those juxtapositions from based on the words that the family would have given us. Now we would often add in the opposite, but and then we would see how that fitted or didn't fit. But the shape was kind of given to us by the words the families used.
Hmm.
So that was another thing that big thing that we took from culture, from ancient culture, yeah.
Hmm. Well, I love that, and I'm going to start thinking more about these juxtapositions and see where it can take me, because the story that you just told about that man on his deathbed, it shows the power of the question. You ask the right question, and that's a beautiful question for for anyone. What kind of legacy do you want to leave behind, or what do you want to be remembered for, or what do you want to remember from your life, your contributions, or whatever? It gets people remembering the things that are the most sacred, the most touching and powerful.
Mm.
And having questions to take you there is really important.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that's the magic of our work is that, and that magic is co-created, you know. That magic is not brought in by the therapist or brought in solely by the client, but it's the, I think in the communing between the people that that's where the magic happens,
Mm-hmm.
and I always trust that the answer is actually in the system we're in. It'll emerge
Mm-hmm.
if you're open and curious enough.
Mm-hmm. That's really hopeful, and if we keep working with families.
Yeah, yeah. And but you can work with families through individuals, do you know? I mean, it's nice to have a group. I don't have the chance to do that anymore, but I work, with people who do. Um, because I'm kind of retiring more and more and more. Uh, yeah, it is. And but I think to develop community and particularly community around intersectionalities, it's important that that does not become divided into silos because then we become pawns for all this fascism that's going around, at the moment. And the world has enough to deal with in that badly we need our communities and community building.
Oh, yeah. Well, is this a good place to stop?
Yeah. Have
I
you?
I so appreciate that you brought in magic as well. It's one of those things that's, yeah, unforeseen, unpredicted, and and really like life-giving. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And I think, most indigenous communities and people who are in touch with their own indigeneity, whatever it is, or wherever they are, understand that magic.
Mhm.
Because the land is magic. My God, look what it's doing at the moment with the animals, the birds, and they're in full song, and they're mating and they're nesting, and the lambs are in the fields, and the dandelions are up and the primroses are up and the forget-me-nots are up. And it's a wildness of just beauty and magic. It is magic, you know.
Yeah. Our next supervision series with Christopher is Supervision in the Wild Places.
Ah, wow. Okay.
So excited. Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I really, really appreciate
Thank you, darling. Yeah.
and learning. And I'm going to be thinking a lot about, yeah, pulling the tension and exploring juxtaposition and, yeah, see where that takes me. So I wish you a beautiful day and a beautiful spring. And, yeah,
Thank you. And you too. And you too. And just continue just your fantastic work.
thank you so much. It's, okay. Thanks everyone for listening. Take care.